The ice hadn't just formed around the door. It had been deliberately poured there, frozen in perfect layers that sealed every gap like concrete. Cade Sullivan stared at the cabin that shouldn't exist according to every family story he'd ever heard. His grandfather Orrin had abandoned this Colorado property in 1951, they said. Walked away and never looked back. But abandoned didn't explain the methodical way someone had turned winter itself into a lock. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who never intended this place to be opened again. 3 weeks had passed since Cade inherited his grandfather's remote property, and every instinct told him to turn around and drive back to Denver. The December wind cut through his jacket like a blade, and the cabin sat in the clearing ahead like something that belonged to a different century. But the legal documents were clear. The property was his now. All 47 acres of wilderness and whatever secrets his family had spent decades pretending didn't exist. His brother Marcus had laughed when Cade mentioned driving up here. "You're wasting your time." Man, Grandpa Orrin sold off everything valuable decades ago. Probably just an old hunting shack he forgot to tear down. But Marcus hadn't seen the surveyor's report that came with the inheritance papers. Hadn't seen the notation about a substantial structure that had been assessed for tax purposes every year since 1951. The inheritance documents showed that Orrin had set up a trust fund specifically to maintain this property, with payments handled by a local attorney until 2019, then transferred to an elderly neighbor named Vera Martinez, who had been managing the legal obligations ever since. The closer Cade got to the cabin, the more wrong everything felt. The structure itself was solid, well-built, designed to withstand harsh mountain winters. Not the kind of place someone just walked away from. The windows were intact. The roof showed signs of recent maintenance, and a generator shed sat beside the main building like someone expected to return. But that ice around the door told a different story. Layers upon layers of it. Built up over years, maybe decades. Like someone had been coming back here regularly, adding more ice each winter, making sure the seal stayed perfect. Cade pulled his phone from his pocket, checking for signal. Nothing. The nearest neighbor was Vera Martinez, who lived 5 miles down the mountain road and had been handling the property's legal affairs since his grandfather's death. She'd given him directions and her spare key to the access gate, mentioning that she knew these mountain lands better than anyone and would keep an eye out if he ran into trouble. When he'd mentioned the cabin, her expression had changed. "Some things are better left alone." "Young man," she'd said, turning away before he could ask what she meant. Now he understood why his grandfather's will had been so specific. The property couldn't be sold until someone in the family had properly inspected the mountain cabin and its surveying equipment. Not the house. Not the land. The cabin and its contents. As if Orrin Sullivan had been waiting 70 years for someone to find whatever he'd sealed away in the ice. Cade circled the cabin twice, looking for another way in. Every window had been sealed from the inside with what looked like heavy plastic sheeting, then reinforced with wooden boards nailed tight against the frames. Professional work. Deliberate work. The kind of preparation someone makes when they plan to keep something preserved for a very long time. But preserved from what? Or preserved for whom? The generator shed was unlocked, and inside he found equipment that shouldn't have existed in 1951. Modern tools, maintenance logs dated as recently as last winter, and a collection of ice-making equipment that made his blood run cold. Industrial-grade units designed to produce massive quantities of ice, along with a system of hoses and pumps that led directly to the cabin's front entrance. Someone had been maintaining this setup for decades, coming up here every winter to add more ice to the seal. The maintenance log was written in his grandfather's handwriting, entries spanning from 1952 all the way to 2019, the year Orrin Sullivan had died. Brief notations. Ice renewed November 15th. Structure secure. Winter seal intact. Contents stable. No signs of deterioration. Contents. Not belongings, not furniture. Contents. Like whatever was inside wasn't just being stored, but was being actively preserved. Cade flipped through pages of meticulous records, his grandfather's careful script documenting temperature readings, ice thickness measurements, and regular structural inspections. But nowhere did the logs explain why. Just the obsessive documentation of someone who understood exactly what would happen if that seal ever failed. A noise behind him made Cade spin around. Vera Martinez stood in the doorway of the generator shed, her weathered face grave with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting this moment for years. I saw your truck here for 3 hours and figured you'd found the equipment, she said, slightly out of breath from the uphill walk. I promised your grandfather I'd check on anyone who came looking for answers. Didn't expect it to take this long. Her voice carried the weight of someone who knew more than she'd ever been willing to share. You knew about this, Cade said, holding up the maintenance log. You knew my grandfather never left. You knew he was coming up here every winter. Vera stepped into the shed, her eyes scanning the ice-making equipment with familiar recognition. Orrin Sullivan was a good man who made a hard choice. He asked me to watch over the access road, make sure no one bothered him during his winter visits. I gave him my word. She paused, studying Cade's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. But he's gone now, and you're here asking questions that have answers you might not want to hear. What's in that cabin? Vera? The old woman looked toward the sealed structure, then back at Cade. Something your grandfather found in 1951 that changed everything. Something he decided was too dangerous to destroy and too important to lose. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. He spent 70 years making sure it stayed exactly where he put it, exactly how he put it. The question is whether you're prepared to finish what he started. The wind picked up, rattling the shed walls, and Cade realized that whatever his grandfather had sealed away, it had been waiting all this time for someone to finally open it. Vera led Cade back to the cabin, her boots crunching through the snow with the confidence of someone who had walked this path many times before. Your grandfather found something in 1951 that he knew would tear this family apart if it ever came to light, so he made a choice. He buried it in ice instead of burying it in the ground. She stopped at the frozen door, running her gloved hand along the thick layers of ice that had accumulated over decades. Some secrets are heavy enough to crush the people you love. Orrin understood that better than most. What kind of secret requires 70 years of hiding? Cade asked, studying the methodical way the ice had been applied. Layer after layer, each one carefully built upon the last, creating a seal that would have taken hours to complete each winter. The kind that changes how you see everything you thought you knew about your family. Vera pulled a folded envelope from her coat pocket, yellowed with age. He gave me this before he died, told me to give it to whoever finally came looking for answers, said it would explain enough to help them decide whether to break the seal or walk away. Cade took the envelope with hands that trembled from more than just the cold. His grandfather's handwriting on the front read, "For the one who finds the cabin." Inside, a single sheet of paper contained a message dated December 15, 2019, just 3 months before Orrin Sullivan's death. If you are reading this, then the choice I made in 1951 has finally come due. Inside this cabin are government documents, survey records, and photographic evidence that prove something I discovered about a land acquisition operation in our county. Something that would have destroyed your grandmother, ruined your father, and changed how the world saw the Sullivan name. I chose to preserve the evidence rather than expose it, to protect the living rather than seek justice for the dead. The ice has kept everything exactly as I found it that day. Every document, every photograph, every piece of surveying equipment and legal evidence that powerful people tried very hard to hide. You can break the seal and learn what I learned, or you can add more ice and let the secret die with me. Either choice comes with a price that will follow you for the rest of your life. Vera watched Cade read the letter twice, her expression unreadable. He never told me exactly what he found, but I saw him the day he discovered it. Saw him come down from this mountain looking like a man who had lost his faith in everything he believed. He aged 10 years in one afternoon, and he never spoke of it again. The wind began to pick up, and snow started falling harder, the kind of weather that could trap someone on the mountain for days. Cade looked at the cabin, then at the letter, then at the woman who had spent decades keeping his grandfather's secret. What would you do, Vera? If this was your family, your choice? She was quiet for a long moment, studying the sealed door. I would ask myself whether the truth is more important than the peace it would destroy. And then I would remember that once you know something, you cannot unknow it. The snow was falling thick enough now that Cade could barely see his truck through the trees. Whatever choice he made, he was committed to it until the storm passed. The storm trapped them in Vera's truck for 2 hours, the heater running while snow piled against the windshield. During that time, she told Cade about his grandfather's final years, how Orrin had become increasingly obsessed with preserving what he called the record, how he had spent every winter making sure the ice seal remained perfect, checking and rechecking that the cabin's contents stayed frozen and undisturbed. He brought me up here once in 2018, showed me the maintenance routine, said if anything happened to him, someone would need to know how to keep the seal intact. Vera stared through the snow at the barely visible cabin. He was terrified that if the ice melted, if the contents thawed and deteriorated, the truth would be lost forever. Said it was the only proof left of something that powerful people had tried very hard to erase. When the storm finally cleared, Cade made his decision. He retrieved a sledgehammer and crowbar from his truck, along with a portable heater he had brought for emergency warmth. If his grandfather had spent 70 years preserving whatever was inside that cabin, then Cade owed it to him to see what was worth protecting. Breaking through the ice took 4 hours of careful work. Each layer revealed different textures and compositions, some clear as glass, others cloudy with trapped air bubbles. The methodical way his grandfather had built these layers became clear as Cade worked through them. This wasn't just preservation, it was engineering. Each layer had been carefully designed to maintain specific temperature and humidity levels, creating a perfect environment for long-term storage. As the final layer of ice began to crack away from the doorframe, Vera stepped back. Once that door opens, there is no going back, Cade. Whatever your grandfather saw that day in 1951, whatever made him spend the rest of his life guarding this place, it becomes your burden now. The door itself was solid oak, reinforced with metal brackets that looked original to the 1950s construction. But as Cade pulled it open, he realized that the cabin wasn't just a storage space. It was a working archive. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their contents visible through glass fronts. Boxes of documents sat on shelves, each one labeled with dates ranging from the 1940s through the early 1950s. And in the center of the room, a large table held what appeared to be official survey maps, government contracts, and photographs spread out exactly as someone had left them decades ago. The surveying equipment mentioned in his grandfather's will sat in the corner. Professional-grade instruments from the 1950s, still in their cases. Everything was perfectly preserved, the cold having stopped time itself inside this mountain tomb. But it was the photographs on the central table that made Cade's breath catch in his throat. Black and white images of land surveys, mining operations, and groups of men in suits standing over what looked like excavation sites. And in several of the photographs, a younger version of his grandfather stood among them, wearing the uniform of a government geological surveyor and holding the same instruments that now sat preserved in the corner. Vera stepped inside behind him, her eyes moving over the preserved archive with the recognition of someone who had suspected what they would find. Your grandfather wasn't just a rancher, Cade. He was working as a government surveyor in 1951, documenting land claims for federal acquisition. And from the look of these documents and this equipment, he discovered something about this land that someone was willing to kill to keep secret. Cade moved to the first filing cabinet, his hands shaking as he opened the glass front. The documents inside were organized with meticulous care, each folder labeled with precise dates and locations. The first folder he pulled contained official government contracts dated 1951, bearing the seal of the Department of Interior. The papers detailed a federal land acquisition project for something called Strategic Mineral Survey Program, with authorization to acquire privately owned land for national security purposes. But it was the survey reports in his grandfather's handwriting that made Cade's stomach drop. Detailed geological assessments that documented rich uranium deposits beneath what had been private ranch land. Land that belonged to 3 families, including a small Native American settlement that had been farming the area for generations. The reports were thorough, professional, and devastating. Orrin Sullivan had found enough uranium beneath those ranches to power the entire American nuclear program. The second folder contained photographs that told a darker story. Images of the 3 families being forcibly removed from their land, their homes being bulldozed, their livestock scattered, men in suits supervising as families loaded their belongings into trucks, children crying as they were driven away from the only homes they had ever known. And in several photos, Cade recognized his grandfather, clipboard in hand, surveying equipment beside him, documenting everything with the cold precision of a government employee doing his job. He was supposed to survey the land after the families were relocated, Vera said quietly, reading over Cade's shoulder. But he arrived 3 days early and saw what really happened. Saw how they forced those people off their land with threats and violence. Saw how they destroyed homes that had stood for decades. The most damning document was a carbon copy of a letter Orrin had written to his supervisor, dated November 15, 1951. In it, he detailed witnessing federal agents threatening the Native American family with arrest if they didn't vacate immediately, despite having legal ownership papers. He described seeing agents plant evidence of trespassing on their own land, then using that false evidence to justify immediate removal. Orrin had documented everything, including names, dates, and badge numbers of the agents involved. The response letter from his supervisor was brief and chilling. "Mr. Sullivan, your services on this project are no longer required. Consider this matter classified under the National Security Act. Any discussion of these events outside official channels will be treated as treason." Vera picked up a photograph of the Native American family standing beside their home, a simple but well-built structure with a garden and corral visible behind them. "The Yazzie family," she said softly. "Maria, Joseph, and their 3 children. They had been farming this land since 1923, had legal deed and everything. They were forced to leave with nothing but what they could carry." Cade stared at the photo, then at his grandfather's detailed documentation of their removal. He witnessed a crime and was told to stay quiet about it. "Worse than that," Vera replied, pulling out another folder. "Look at the final survey report he was ordered to submit." The official document bore Orrin's signature, but contained completely falsified information. It reported the land as uninhabited, claimed no evidence of recent occupation, and recommended immediate federal acquisition for mineral rights exploitation. Everything his grandfather had witnessed, everything he had documented, had been erased from the official record. The final folder in the cabinet contained personal documents that explained why this secret had consumed the rest of Orrin's life. Bank records from 1952 showed a payment of $50,000 deposited into the Sullivan family account, officially listed as geological consulting fees. But the accompanying internal memo, stamped with official seals, told the real story. It was hush money, payment for Orrin's silence about what he had witnessed and documented. Cade's hands trembled as he read the memo. In consideration of Mr. Sullivan's cooperation in finalizing the mineral survey project and his agreement to maintain confidentiality regarding operational details, payment is authorized for consulting services rendered. The bureaucratic language couldn't hide what it really meant. His grandfather had been bought off, paid to stay quiet about the illegal removal of 3 families from their land. But the most devastating document was a handwritten letter from Orrin to his wife, dated December 1951, never sent. In it, he confessed everything. How he had arrived early and witnessed the forced removal. How he had been threatened with treason charges if he spoke out. How the money they had used to buy their own ranch, to start their family's prosperity, had come from his silence about the destruction of other families. "I have become something I never wanted to be," the letter read. "I took money for my silence while good people lost everything. I told myself it was for you and our future children, but that is a lie. I was afraid of going to prison, afraid of being labeled a traitor, afraid of losing everything. So I let them lose everything instead. The money we are using to build our life is stained with their suffering, and I do not know how to live with that knowledge." Vera stood beside Cade as he read, her face filled with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. "Your grandfather spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how to make it right. He couldn't give the money back because that would require explaining where it came from. He couldn't expose the truth because they still had those treason charges hanging over his head. So he preserved everything, hoping that someday someone would know what to do with it." The preserved documents told the complete story of a government operation that had violated federal law, constitutional rights, and basic human decency. Orrin had unwittingly become part of it, then been trapped by his own fear into maintaining silence. The uranium mine had operated for 30 years, generating millions in federal revenue, all built on land stolen from families who had legal ownership. But there was more. A folder marked personal research contained documents Orrin had spent decades collecting. Obituaries for the displaced families, records showing how the Yazzie family had died in poverty after being forced from their land, how the other families had never recovered from losing everything they had built over generations. Joseph Yazzie had died in 1967, still fighting in court for recognition of his land rights. Maria had passed away in 1973, having never seen justice for what had been done to her family. Cade sank into a chair that had been perfectly preserved in the frozen cabin, the weight of the discovery crushing down on him. This is why he sealed it all away. This is why he couldn't tell anyone. "And now it is your decision," Vera said quietly. "You can walk away, let it stay buried. and your family keeps their reputation and their peace. Or you can do what your grandfather could never bring himself to do. You can tell the truth. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up again, and snow was starting to fall. Soon, the mountain roads would be impassable, and whatever choice Cade made would have to sustain him through a long winter of consequences. The storm outside grew fierce enough to rattle the cabin windows, trapping Cade and Vera inside with 70 years of buried truth. Wind howled through the mountain peaks, sending ice crystals against the glass like bullets. Vera moved slowly to the table where the photographs lay scattered, her weathered hands trembling as she picked up the image of the Yazzie family. Maria Yazzie was my grandmother. She held the photograph up to the lamplight, pointing to a small girl standing beside the corral. That is me, 7 years old. Thunder rolled across the peaks outside, shaking the entire cabin. I watched federal agents bulldoze our house while my mother cried. Cade's breath caught as the implications hit him. Vera set down the photograph and opened a small wooden box that had been sitting among the preserved documents. Inside were 3 items: a child's bracelet, a faded hair ribbon, and a small wooden horse carved by hand. My grandfather Joseph made this horse for me the week before they came. She held up the tiny carving, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. Your grandfather found it in the rubble after our house was destroyed. He kept it all these years. Outside, a tree branch crashed against the cabin roof, making both of them flinch. He tried to make amends, Vera continued, moving to the window as lightning illuminated the frozen landscape. Paid for my schooling, helped my family find work, but he never told me why. She turned back to face Cade. When he asked me to help maintain this place, I understood. He was preserving evidence, not hiding it. The wind picked up again, rattling every board in the cabin structure. Cade stared at the wooden horse, at the photograph, at this woman who had spent decades waiting for this moment. So you have been waiting for someone to finally open this place. I have been waiting for someone with the courage to do what your grandfather could not. Lightning split the sky again, and in its brief illumination, Cade could see the weight of history in her eyes. Snow began hitting the windows horizontally, driven by winds that threatened to shatter the glass. Both of them could hear trees cracking under the pressure of ice and wind. They would be trapped here until morning, maybe longer. The storm was making the decision for them. Whatever choice Cade made would have to sustain him through a long night of consequences. Cade picked up the letter his grandfather had written but never sent. The paper yellowed with age. If I expose this, it destroys everything people believe about my family. Vera nodded slowly, still holding the wooden horse. Your grandfather died carrying this weight. Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered. But he left you something he never had. Proof. Documentation. Outside, another tree fell somewhere in the darkness, the sound echoing across the mountain. And if I stay silent, then nothing changes. Vera placed the wooden horse back in its box. The families who lost everything remain forgotten. The truth stays buried. Lightning illuminated the cabin again, showing the archive around them. Decades of preserved evidence waiting for judgment. Cade looked at the documents spread across the table, at the photograph of a 7-year-old girl who had lost her home, at the woman she had become. The wind howled louder, as if the mountain itself was demanding an answer. In the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the evidence of a 70-year-old crime, he finally understood what his grandfather had never been able to face. Some truths are too important to stay frozen. Dawn broke gray and cold, but the storm had passed, leaving the mountain world crystalline and silent. Cade woke stiff from sleeping in the wooden chair, surrounded by the evidence that would either free him or destroy him. Vera sat by the window, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in pale gold, the wooden horse still cradled in her weathered hands. For 2 hours, Cade photographed every document with meticulous care, his phone camera capturing each page of his grandfather's testimony, each image of the displaced families, each piece of evidence that proved the government's crime. His hands shook as he worked, knowing that each photograph was a step toward a choice he could never undo. When he finished, he sat staring at his phone, finger hovering over the contacts list. One phone call to the Department of Justice would set everything in motion. One phone call would end 70 years of silence and begin a reckoning that would consume his family for generations. His phone buzzed. A text from his brother Marcus. Hope you found some old furniture up there. Ready to put this mountain property behind us and move on. The message felt like a knife between his ribs. Marcus had no idea that their family's entire legacy was about to be rewritten. Cade started to dial the Department of Justice, then stopped, started again, then set the phone down. The weight of the decision pressed against his chest like a physical force. He thought about his father, who had built his life on money earned from silence about suffering. His grandmother, who had died never knowing the truth about their prosperity. His cousins, his nephews, his nieces, all of whom would wake up one day soon to find their family name connected to federal crimes and government cover-ups. Second thoughts? Vera asked quietly, not taking her eyes off the mountain vista. Third thoughts? Fourth thoughts? Cade picked up the photograph of the Yazzie family again, studying the faces of people who had been forgotten by history. Once I make this call, everything changes. There will be no going back. Vera finally turned from the window, her eyes holding the accumulated weight of decades. Your grandfather spent 43 years hoping someone else would make this choice for him. He died waiting for courage he could never find. She stood slowly, joints creaking with age and cold. But courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what is right despite the fear. Cade's phone buzzed again. Another text from Marcus. Dad would have been proud we kept the family land together. The irony was devastating. Their father would have been proud, but only because he had never known the truth about how they had gotten the land in the first place. With his hand trembling, Cade dialed the number for the Department of Justice. A voice answered on the second ring. I need to report a federal crime, he said, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. My name is Cade Sullivan, and I have evidence of government misconduct from 1951. As he spoke to the federal investigator, arranging to turn over 70 years of preserved evidence, Vera began securing the cabin. But instead of adding ice to seal it shut again, she left the door unlocked. Let it thaw, Cade said when he ended the call. The truth doesn't need to be frozen anymore. Months later, federal investigators confirmed every detail of Orrin Sullivan's testimony. The Yazzie family and other displaced families received formal acknowledgement and reparations. Cade's family name was forever changed, and some relatives never forgave him. But as he sat on his grandfather's porch, watching the mountains where the cabin now stood open to the warming air, Cade felt something his grandfather had never been able to experience. The peace that comes from choosing courage over fear, truth over comfort, justice over family reputation. The terrible weight of 70 years of silence had finally been lifted, and the dead could rest knowing their story had been told. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where family secrets and moral choices collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.